Good morning. Yep. So let me start with a question like what you know about big data. So whenever we say big data, what is that comes to your mind? So yeah, so big data in simple words, big data. So 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 what is the what are the complexities that are involved in big data, and how we can overcome those complexities. So these are a couple of topics that is going on in the industry. How we can come up with a best solution from maintaining the data point of view, and another important aspect is how we can make sure that the data is a right data, and it's being reached to the end users in a proper shape, or as the end user expects basically. So in today's session, what I'm going to cover is how we can make sure the data is verified, and the completeness of data before it reaches out to the end users. And we have made an effort of how we can make sure to validate this data in an automated fashion. So we have come up with a solution using Selenium and Java. And I'll explain you like why we have taken this approach of Selenium and Java, why not any other tools or technologies. So whenever we are talking about big data, so generally these are the jargons that come to our mind. One is the Hadoop, which is the backbone of the or one of the best solutions that is available across the industry to deal with a couple of complexities that is associated with the big data. And then we have something called a MapReduce, so which is a part of the this whole infrastructure, or the implementation of Hadoop, which basically deals with the business logic, which basically helps to to parse the structured or the unstructured data. So what we have done is we are using the same concepts. We are using whatever is built in a MapReduce, and we try to build certain components or a framework on top of it to extract the data, to read the data, and make sure that the data is displayed or rendered properly on the UI. So typically when we are talking about big data, these are the couple of things which basically brings the complexity. One is the volume, the huge volume of data flowing across systems. And then we have the data which covers in the length and breadth of the industry, that is the variety of the data. And then velocity, the speed it comes to the system. And then the variability. So this is basically, if you look at divided into two broad categories, that is the structured and the unstructured, and then the veracity. So if on the other side, if you look at because of these characteristics of the data brings a lot of complexity into the system. And since the data is distributed across the storage locations, so how we can bring this data into a common platform so that it can be presented in a right way to the end users, or we can have a couple of analytics which will help the business to grow in their organization. So if we look at on the top layer, we have the ETL tools, and then we have a couple of reporting tools. So these are basically the consumers for the data that is flowing into the system. And then we have something in the middle, that is the MapReducer, which will have all the logic built in it, which will help us to present the data the way we want. And then in the bottom, that is the most complex thing, that is HDFC, so the Hadoop Distributed File System. So basically, if you look at big data, so the data is scattered across the systems, and we wanted to bring the data into one place and process it, and then create or generate or publish various reports out of that data. So that's where if you look at this complete architecture, that will help us to get into that stage. But I will not talk much about big data now. So we'll see, how this big data is catering to various industry, and then we will get into how we can come up with an automated solution to validate this data. So if you look at the industry, so these are the industries broadly where the data is flowing in and out. And if you look at the channels, there are various channels like, you have the desktop, you have the mobile, and then you have tablets, and then you have various versions of the applications through which day in, day out, the end users will interact with those systems, and the data will flow into the data storage devices. So if you look at a high level, these are the basic testing types that need to be in place for any organization which is dealing with big data, and they are, they wanted to make sure the data is presented in a proper way. So on the top, you can see we have the functional testing, test automation, and then the web services or the API level testing. And then integration testing is something very important when it comes to the big data context. And then compatibility, again, since we have multiple channels of this data to be presented to the end users, so we will have to make sure that how the data is getting displayed or rendered on various devices or across the systems. So that's where we have this compatibility, again another key aspect when it comes to the current industry. And then data warehousing and business intelligence, then we have the mobility testing, and then migration testing, where if the data is in some legacy system, how do we want to migrate that data to the more standardized system, and how we can make sure that the post and pre-migration, the pre and post migration, data validations and all that stuff. And then performance testing, since we are dealing with huge data, so it's very important for us that whatever the system that we have in place is behaving as expected, and and the data is flashing in real quick. Security testing, this is typically is important for any web applications, and for any applications which has multi-channels. So this is another aspect that we definitely need to look at when we are thinking about the data security and all that stuff. And then most importantly, the globalization. So the data is being accessed by various people across the globe. So it has to convey the same manner, and we have to make sure that all this language support and the internalization and nationalization is taken care of it. So when it comes to specifically big data, so we have to have something the file validations, and then the job validation, and most importantly the data validation. And since we are dealing with some hundreds of thousands of terabytes of data, we cannot really validate each and every data input. So we'll have to have a strategy how we can come up with a sampling. So that will basically give us the subset of the test data, and which can be used which basically covers the length and breadth of the all aspects of the data that is lying in the systems. And then the validation of the workflows. So I think you guys are aware of PIG, so which basically defines the workflow from within the Hadoop system, so and which basically deals with the mapping and the reverse mapping. So we have to make sure that the mappings and the reverse mappings are well taken care of, and whatever logic that is being implemented while doing this mapping and reverse mapping needs to be validated once the data is migrated or once the data is presented on the target systems. So then the query expressions validations, because it involves a lot of querying and involves a lot of backend procedures. So we'll have to make sure that the logic is properly implemented into these procedures, so that the data, whenever it gets filtered and gets displayed based on your search criteria or whatever. So it's pulling the right data from the system and presenting on the UI. And then finally, the report validation. So it's fine, we are making sure that the data which is there in the backend is valid and it's neat and clean. But how about when I'm generating a MIS report, or for that matter any kind of report that goes to my executive management and the report has some flaws in it. So we'll have to make sure, since the data is scattered across and coming through from certain complex systems, we have to make sure that the data that is presented on the report is of good quality. So if you look at test automation, so before I get into test automation, let us talk about manual testing. So just imagine a situation where you have to do manual testing of such a complex system and of the data which is coming through that complex system. So definitely it's going to be time consuming, and secondly there is every possibility that we might miss some key scenarios while doing the validation. So it's better to have a structured way of validating the data and to have a consistent way of validating the data. So that's where the whole thought process came into picture, how we can really automate this manual process and make sure that we are in line with the market demand and we are really coping up with the market. So that is another key point. If you look at in the bottom, the consistency of testing efforts, time to market, and most importantly the user experience. So we have come up with a unified test automation framework. Again, this framework we have built on top of Selenium Java. So let me quickly explain about these components. So basically all of them are coded components, and if you look at this framework, this is Pro Agile. So that means you can have your complete automation suite, which is built on top of Selenium and Java, can be integrated with your CI process, continuous integration process, and whenever you do any check-in of your code or the development code, automatically the whole automation suite gets triggered, and the execution will happen overnight or in an unattended fashion. So what we have done here is, if you look at any typical UI automation, so we basically deal with the UI components that are rendered on the web page. But we have extended this framework and we have added a couple of coded components that you get to see on the top. That is the HDS files, or the Hadoop reporting and the databases. So basically these are the components that we have built on top of Selenium framework, which will enable this whole framework to do testing at the API level. So we directly interact with the Hadoop server, and we interact with the business logic that is written within the map reducer. And also we leverage the same technology to access data from various systems, and then we validate the data on various channels like the web applications or the mobile applications that is displayed in the bottom. So by this, what we are doing, we are hitting three things. One, we are making sure that the data is valid, And we are also making sure that the transportation layer through which the data flows into the front end. So we are validating the transport layer, that is typically web services. So we are leveraging the API like HTTP client or SOAP UI APIs to do that web services level or the transport level validations. And then finally, when this data gets rendered on the page, that's where we are using Selenium API, Selenium WebDriver. And also we have extended the Selenium WebDriver by using the APM, which is again built on top of Selenium, to cover all the channels. So if you look at another aspect of it, why we have taken Java, because the solutions that are available across big data as on date are built on top of Java. So that's the reason we have taken Java as the underlying programming language, so that I can easily interact with the APIs or the code component that is built as part of the Hadoop. So this solution will basically enable us to do the complete end-to-end testing right from the back-end layer to the middle layer and then the front-end layer. So any questions or anything that you wanted to ask? Yeah, sure. Sure. Let me take an example of a typical banking application. So nowadays, if you look at banking applications, when you log in into the system, it shows you a kind of analysis saying that where are the areas that you are spending money. So if you look at this, the graph looks very simple, and it says that, okay, you have spent money in some movie theaters, or you have spent money on clothing, or you spent money on restaurants and all that stuff. But have you ever thought of how this data is pulled into that banking system? So that's where this analytics comes into picture. So whenever you use your credit card or debit card, so all the transactions that are flowing into various applications spread across various industry will be pulled through a server or a middle layer with which these banking applications are again tied with. So they will have a transportation layer, typically the web services, which takes care of transporting the data and provide to the banks. So that is one classic example, because day in, day out we do a lot of banking. So I thought of taking that example. But if you look at any other industry, that's where the whole business is moving towards. And let me give you another example. Like, say if you are using in your mobile nowadays, if you see, like, in wherever region you enter, you get to see certain advertisements specific to that region. So if your mobile has that enabled, like, capture the current location where I am. So basically it takes that data and it goes into the server, it looks for that data, and then it pulls out all the information or the advertisements that are specific to that region. So a day will come when you go to a mall and then you see all the offers that are displaying on your mobile that are currently going on in that mall. So automatically, like, this data will be pulled using your current location, and certain ads and analytics or all that stuff will be popped up on your mobile devices, or for that matter, any device that you use for shopping or anything. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes. So Selenium we are using wherever there is a web interface, but wherever there is no GUI and we have to interact with various other interfaces at the API level, so we have built certain components which basically takes care of interacting with that. And if I take an example of SOAP UI, I can always write certain test cases or scenarios in SOAP UI. I can have the properties defined, and I can fire a request and get the response and get the values, and those values can be input for my next request. So similarly, what we have done here is we are using the HTTP client, so which basically sends that request to the backend system. Then it gets all the data. Then we parse that data, and from the parameters we pull that data. Then we give that data dynamically to Selenium so that it can go on the front end UI and validate if the data is correctly displayed or not. So we have done that level of integration, and we also have extended this whole framework to pull the data from the backend system as well. It could be in any format. It could be in an RDBMS, and it could be unstructured, that is like in flat files and laying across the systems. So as long as we have access, so we have a property file which basically holds all these information, and it accesses that particular system and gets the data from there. Sure. That is the whole point of this big data. If the data is not at all useful, there is no need of maintaining this data. So where is this data useful? So since the end user wanted to see this data, these analytics, and that's where the requirement came into picture, and they wanted to have this whole system of maintaining this data and pulling this data. Another classic example is Facebook. So Facebook, you wanted to see a lot of pictures of your friend circle, and if you go to Google Maps, so you get to see based on your location what are the nearby areas, tourist places or all that stuff. So ultimately, if you look at this whole business, it ends with the end user. So we all are striving towards or struggling to make the end user happy. So if you look at Selenium behaves as the end user. So for that matter, if you look at any other tool, the tool behaves as if it's an end user, and then we use that tool to make sure that the end user experience is met in that particular system or not. So that's where I'm coming from. So if you look at the focus all these days was how to maintain the data. But now, since we have the solutions built and we know how to maintain the data, now the focus is going towards how the end user will be happy by seeing this data. So if you look at mobile devices, or for that matter any mobility devices, so there is no need of investing a lot of effort into developing certain mobile devices. So where the need came from is from the end user. He wanted to be always connected with his data, so whether he is on the go or in the office. So that's where the whole industry is moving towards mobility. And similarly, when we are talking about mobility and when we are talking about the any system for that matter, it's the data that plays the important role in that system. Yep. Mm-hmm. Sure. Not necessarily. So we can still leverage whatever you have currently, which is written on top of Ruby, because all other part except for the UI, so can be done in Java, and we can always pull that information from wherever system, whichever system you want, and the same can be fed into the framework that you have in place, in form of parameters until unless it is tightly coupled with the test data. So I've seen in many cases where people do automation, but they tightly couple the test data within the scripts. They hard code it. So as long as the data is not hard coded and it's parameterized, and as long as we are able to initialize those parameters with the dynamic data, I think we can use any other system, or whether it be Ruby, Python, or C#, anything. So I think that's possible. It's only that we have to build that bridge in between, and then we are good to go. Yeah. Sorry. For the traceability? For the traceability, like if I come from requirement, so definitely you will be having that traceability between your requirement and then the manual test cases. So if I get your question correct, so you're looking at how I make sure that what are the automated scripts I have, so whether I'm covering, I have enough coverage with respect to the manual test cases. Okay. Yeah, so when we build these scripts, so we basically tie the script with the manual steps. So it could be in form of a simple Excel, or it could be any other test management tools. So where we tie these manual test cases with the scripts. So that's how we have that link established between these two, and we make sure that they are traced. No, it's actually the other way around. So whenever there is a change in the system, so you generally update your manual test cases, and that will have an impact on the automated test cases. So yes, in one way, if you look at whether you come from this side or that side, you'll have to make some changes. But again, it all depends on the type of the change. So if it is really a workflow change, then yes, you have to change the scripts. But if it is just a UI level change, you don't really have to change the scripts. So, any other questions anyone have? Yes, ma'am. So, it all depends on the approach that we take. Suppose there are certain data points which can be generated as long as we have the seed data. So we build certain logic so that we can generate this seed data. Say for example, some of the transactional data that cannot be really generated of our own. It has to flow, or it has to because it will have a lot of reference with the master data. But if you look at the master data, that is something can be generated using the seed data. So say for example, a demographic of a person, so that can be generated. But once that person demographics are into the system, and when there are certain transactions that are already happened on that system, that's where I'm coming from, that cannot be really generated or created. We try to maximum make those tests independent of nature. The reason being, we define the entry and exit criteria such a way that, or we in the sense, generally if you look at automation, the entry and exit criteria has to be defined in such a manner that the scenario ends from login and then, starts from login and ends with logout kind of a thing. So we always make sure we are coming back to the base state of the application. So that way, as long as you make sure that you are coming back to the base state, then your test cases are independent by themselves, and there won't be any dependency between these test cases. Secondly, if you're looking at the test data dependency, so we can always have the master data, which is a test data, basically a set. And that data will be used whenever you do any kind of regression or anything. So that way, if you look at, you can reduce the dependency, but there might be certain situations where you have to do the end-to-end testing using the dynamic data. So in that case, the dependency has to be defined. So it all depends on the scenarios. So most of the insurance applications or banking and finance application, we see this kind of a test data dependency. But if you look at any other industry, so we don't see any such dependency in the test data. So yeah. So the answer is yes and no. So it all depends on the type of the industry or type of the scenarios that we are testing. So I think I have that's like as part of my session. So if you have any queries or anything, I'm open to discuss. Otherwise, like the message that I wanted to pass is like it's time to look at automated solution as far as big data testing is concerned. So, and we have taken the approach of Selenium because it's all the beauty of the Selenium. It's powerful, it's open source, and it supports multiple languages, technology stack, and it can be integrated with your existing development process because it's a library-based test automation. It's lightweight, and we can also, what we have done is we have extended this whole framework to make it enable, you can do the execution on the cloud. So we have built the capabilities like Sauce Labs or browser stack capabilities. So you can do parallel execution, you can use the Selenium's grid implementation, and so you can really speed up the whole process of your development, SDLC and STLC. Yeah, so thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thanks.